We've knitted the front and back of our puppet on our knitting machine, so now we're going to sew it together. We lay the two pieces right sides together and line up the design as carefully as we can. You can use ordinary sewing pins for this process. I'm using these larger pins that are handy for working with knitted fabric. They're made by Clover and they're called marking pins for knitting. So we just pin all the way around just outside the design, and further out straight up the sides here for our puppet. And line up around the arms and the head. And as Mickey has a rather small head, I allowed a little extra space at the top here, extra space for your fingers when you're operating the puppet. And also pin up a hem at the bottom, which in fact is going to be the first thing we sew when we move over to the sewing machine. We're aiming to be sewing a stitch or two outside the line of the design. So of course it doesn't have to be the most precise sewing you've ever done. And remember that we're going to be cutting off a section of this knitting when we're done, so this is a good place to do some practice stitching. I'll put some dark thread in here for our practice stitching so you can see what I'm doing. My machine is set to do a plain zigzag 3 millimeters wide and 2 millimeters long. Could even go a little wider or a little shorter maybe. We'll be doing a double row of stitching just to make sure everything gets caught in the stitches and doesn't fray when we cut the edge. Back to our white thread, we're going to start by sewing the two hems. Especially when you're working crossways, you may need to sort of nudge the fabric into the in under the presser foot so it doesn't stretch out. And line up the edges, and now we can start sewing our main seam all the way around. This bit here around the arm is a little tricky to see where you are. Just make sure everything's still smooth on the back. You may be able to separate the threads a little bit to see where you are. And remember that a bit of extra clearance we decided on around the top of the head. When you've sewn all the way around once, you can inspect your sewing and make sure it's roughly close to the line the way you want it, and you can also partially turn it inside out and check. You can't turn it fully till after we've trimmed the seams. And now back to the sewing machine and do a whole second round of stitching just outside what you did the first time. Or if you have a serger, you could use it for the second row, but the first row really needs to be done on a regular machine with a zigzag. And now we're cutting it out just outside our second row of stitching. And cut carefully here in the arm shoulder area. What you're aiming to do is clip in as close as you can to the stitching in the corner there, but obviously without cutting your actual sewing. It's all cut out, we can turn it right side out, and this main part is finished. If you're not going to make a lining, which we'll get to in a moment, you probably will need to sew down some of these loose threads. To make a lining, start by making a pattern by drawing around your puppet with a 1/4 inch or so seam allowance. And cut out 2 layers in your fabric. It can be any fabric, it doesn't have to be white like this. And sew around it with a straight stitch on the machine. and turn up a hem and sew that down too. And clip into the corners here at the arms, even though we won't actually be turning this one inside out. And pull the knitted one over the lining, and if you want to, you can stitch the two edges down together, or you can just leave them separate like this. And that's it, we're finished.